It's normally good afternoon, but this one's at 11:30, so I will still say good morning. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and the Press, and we are here hosting the Provost and President's Readers Meet the Author. And what better events to have than this in the library? We have ideas that are locked up in books and in journal articles, or you're downloading them from your desktop. But this is where we actually get to hear from an author, hear people engage ideas, have you get the opportunity to also engage with the author. So now we're actually having those intellectual conversations, and that's where I feel like the library has an opportunity to be a heart of campus, heart of intellectual inquiry and dialogue. Before we get started, I do want to read our Baylor's land acknowledgement. And I do ask that not only you listen to the first part where we acknowledge peoples that were here, but think about the second part. And are there ways that any of your work can go towards engagement with indigenous communities? We respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus in Independence are on the land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, Numanu, Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipanapanchi. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization and American expansionism. In recognition that these native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus locations, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. I now turn this over to our provost, Dr. Nancy Brickhouse.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just have to ask, this is Brutalist, right?
I did see that movie. It's not quite brutalist.
It's not quite Brutalist? Okay. I have a lot to learn in this space. Anyway, I want to just welcome everybody to this installment of Reader Meet the Author. This is a series where we feature single-authored, book-length projects of Baylor faculty and invite the community in for a conversation around the subject of their study. And so today I'm really thrilled to welcome Elise Edwards, who will be talking about her latest book, Architecture, Theology, and Ethics, Making Architectural Design More Just. And she is interviewed by Anne Theroux. Let me just say a little bit about both of these individuals here. Dr. Edwards is an assistant professor of religion and teaches courses in Christian ethics and theology. She arrived at Baylor in 2013 after completing her Ph.D. in theology, ethics, and culture at Claremont Graduate University. Prior to that, she got a bachelor's and a master's degree in architecture from Florida A&M. Oops. Yeah. Florida A&M, and worked in the field for 8 years with a firm. So she's like the real thing. She's a doer. That designs spaces on college and university campuses. Based in her training experience, her research integrates the field of architecture theory, aesthetics, theology, and ethics, examining issues of civic engagement and cultural expression, particularly rewarding women in marginalized communities. In addition to her latest publication, Edwards has co-edited the Rutledge Handbook of Religion and Cities in 2020, and her essays and articles have been published in edited volumes and journals. And interviewing her today is Anne Theroux, who is a clinical associate professor of interior design and has been teaching at Baylor since 2014. She is a Baylor Interior Design graduate and received her Master of Arts with distinction from the University of Buckingham in the UK in Decorative Arts and Historic Interiors. During her 15-year career as a hospitality and residential interior designer, she led numerous successful design projects around the world, from Kensington Palace in London to luxury hotels in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Her research interests include the history of 18th century British and French decorative arts and the intersections of human behavior and interior environments. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end. If you're online, you can put your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom so that we can review those questions, and we will have time for answering those questions and the questions of the audience here after the conversation between Ann and Elise. So I'm going to hand it off to them.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I thought that we might get started today just by providing a little bit of background of how Elise and I met, because I think that it's a great Baylor matchmaking story. We met in Summer Faculty Institute in the room right next door, and hit it off immediately when we discovered that we both came out of practice for architecture and interiors, and then even more amazingly discovered that we worked for firms that were located about 4 or 5 blocks down the street from each other at the same time for years. So we became friends immediately from that, and it's fun to see other people from our cohort here. So if you haven't done SFI, that's a good plug for friendship with that. But I wonder if you're a bit like me in coming into this second phase of your career, that you feel as though you've led this entirely other life that still is a part of you. I feel that way, and wonder if that's true for you.
Yes.
And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to just give a little bit of background about your professional experience as an architect, as a registered architect, sector you worked in, how long, and maybe a favorite project or most impactful project.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really exciting to see so many friends and colleagues and students from different phases of my life here at Baylor. So before I came here to Baylor and before I did my graduate work in theology, I was in the Washington, D.C. area practicing architecture at a firm that did mostly, well, we did all kinds of buildings, but I focused on college and university work and campus planning. So it's delightful that now I do my job in the type of facilities that I used to design. And one of the things that I think ran through all the different types of projects. So I didn't just do college and university work. And as you know, colleges and universities have all different kinds of buildings on them. So you have housing, you have chapels, you have libraries. So I worked on several different academic buildings and theater buildings and all sorts of stuff. It's a great sector to work in. But before the thing that runs through all those projects is a sense of who we're designing for, right? And campus communities bring in so many different kinds of people as well, which makes it exciting. You have, of course, students and faculty and staff, but you have visitors to the campus. And a project I worked on that's one of my favorites is the Health Sciences Building in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is my hometown. I was working on a project for Montgomery College, which is the community college for the county that I was in, Montgomery County, Maryland. And it was originally a Tacoma Park campus, which is another city that I lived in. And I think I was living in it when the project first started. So it was like my hometown and where I was living at the time. But the campus was expanding, and it was moving across a set of train tracks, Amtrak and Metro, the local subway system. And we had to figure out a way to connect this new building, which was on a main street, Georgia Avenue, and connect it to the existing campus, which is in a more residential, tree-lined setting. And one of the exciting things about doing this project is that we did the campus planning for it, envisioning this whole new section of growth across the train tracks in Silver Spring. And we got to design conceptually a pedestrian bridge that crossed over. And then that became a project. That wasn't my project, but that became a project in our office. And then the Health Sciences Building, which is my favorite because it was the first project that I worked on that drew together so many different types of departments in one academic building. So I got to see design the classrooms where they were doing rad tech, like the imaging programs, people who are training for that. And then different types of spaces for nursing, and there was even a health sciences clinic on the lower level. So, actually creating like doctors' rooms. And all of this in my hometown, which is super exciting because then my family would drive by or they'd call me or text me and they'd say, I saw your building today, as if it was like my building. Architecture is very much a team discipline. So it's like, yeah, I can take credit for that little part,
Exactly.
that detail up there, and that didn't come out quite the way it was supposed to be on the drawings, but that was fine. I told them what to do when it got messed up, and everything worked out okay. But it was exciting because it brought together so many different kinds of people for that project, but it was also a way of contributing to the place where I lived and expanding the offerings of this local community college that so many of my friends had gone to.
Yeah. When you are practicing in a multidisciplinary commercial practice, you end up becoming a little expert in all
Yes.
of these niche areas,
Yes.
like how to design a lab.
Yes.
Which you didn't know before that
Yes.
necessarily.
I knew nothing about clinic spaces and medical offices and learned very quickly.
Well, when we were chatting last week, I asked you, what do you hope that people would leave this meeting knowing or knowing in a fresh way about architecture and design? And I loved your response because I felt like it was very invitational. And I wonder if you could just kind of recap your heart.
Sure. Well, hopefully it's the same response because it's the thesis of the book, which is the idea that I want people to come away with the sense of what design is, both in the sense that it's not just making spaces functional or beautiful, but that it's about creating the spaces in which we live, and that creates the conditions in which we live. So a space like this room, this Flex Commons, makes it possible for us to have this event here today, right? And I'm really excited we're having this event. So that's one thing. I want us to understand how expansive design is, and that it literally creates the world that we do most of our living in. But the other thing I want people to understand is that it's not just for professional designers. And both of us are highly educated and trained in this and very much believe in the role of professional designers, right? You are educating them, right? But it's understanding that professional designers have their expertise, but they don't know everything about the building process. Or they know everything, they know what they need to know about the building process, but they don't know everything they need to know about the communities for which we design. And everybody in this room is part of a community in which design happens and takes place. And everyone in here hopefully has some way that they've made a space that they occupy, whether it's just as a student in a dorm room or in an office space or a garden you might have at your home, that we've had ways that we take the spaces that we are occupying or dwelling within and we make them our own in some kind of way. I want all of us to think about that as a kind of design that we do, no matter how small scale. So whether it's just putting up artwork in your cubicle, which is what I did in my architectural design firm, right? I had open office space, a cubicle. I didn't have windows near me, but I put up lots of pictures of windows in my space, right? That was an act of design that was saying something about what I thought I deserved and what I needed to make that space habitable. So everyone can participate in that. And when we do that, we're creating the conditions in which we live. And here's the thing, the theological part, I think God cares about how we live and the world that we live in and how we make it.
Absolutely. Great. Well, sort of pinging off of that, I was really thrilled that you started your book just very practically with outlining the design process. And I loved that because that's how we start with our interior design students as well. We don't start with the ADA, which is very, very important, or with color theory, but really with teaching students the process of design. And so I'm wondering if you could provide just sort of a view behind the veil of the professional architect, so that the audience has a picture of what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I actually I had planned when I did the book to do several images. I ended up only having a few, but one of the diagrams that I did include in here is a diagram of the design process, because I thought it was so important. It's sort of a road map. It's like literally a road in that picture. But the idea, the design process is really begins before what we would call design. In fact, it's a phase we call pre-design, in which you're really doing the idea phases behind a building. So it's the programming where you're figuring out what are the spaces in a building, what are the users, who are the needs, or who are the users, what are the needs, and you're putting these things together in a sense that tells you what the building needs. So that's pre-design, when you're just seeing whether it's even feasible to do a project, you're checking out the money, all this sort of stuff happens way before design begins. And then when you start design, you begin with conceptual phases. So there are a few phases of early conceptual or schematic design where you're really getting a sense of what the building might look like, how the spaces shape out, right? What are some of the functional relationships, what that looks like in a very early sense in illustrations and in models maybe, or 3D computer generated models. And then when you get an approval on that, when everybody's like, yeah, that's where we want this to go, and that could take a couple of rounds of iterations.
Yes.
Design is a very iterative process. It's always going back to the drawing board and being revised. Once you reach on something that's close enough, you move into design development, which is really where you begin to think about building systems, like the mechanical needs and how everything comes together. You're getting better sense of what the building might cost. And then you move into construction documents, which design development is leading towards. But construction documents is where you take the project from this idea phase and these early drawings to the things that actually get built. So this is what people tend to refer to as blueprints, although they're not blueprints anymore. Right. So we call them a set of drawings or a set of plans. But they're all different kinds of drawings in there by so many different disciplines. And so in this phase is when you're working with the engineers and the interior designers and the contractors sometimes to really refine what this is. And they're not only producing drawings, but a written set of documents called specs or specifications that are detailing, like narratively, what the different types of products in the building and the types of assemblies that are in there. So all of that leads to construction or to contracting and bidding. And this is a typical design, bid, build process, where then you get contractors bidding on it, submitting their bids on how much they think it's going to cost. Sometimes then you go back and do value engineering, you cut stuff out of the building to make it meet the budget, but then eventually you roll into construction. And that's when the design team moves into the phase where they're answering questions about the drawings and the specs, and when the contractors run into issues, they're answering questions on how, from a design perspective, to solve that. So then finally you have project completion, although some projects will have a post-occupancy phase after that, where they actually will do studies on how is the building performing. Right? So that's especially important if you have concerns about energy usage and you had built into the project for the building to meet certain metrics. You want to make sure that that's actually performing at the way that it did.
It's great to hear an architect say that in front of some of my students, so that they know we're not messing around. This is actually the process.
Yes, yes.
It happens every time.
Yeah, and it can take several years for projects the size of like a library. It can take a decade for really huge projects. The Sagrada Familia is still under construction, but will be complete in my lifetime.
Right.
So,
And how many projects might you work on at the same time?
yes, multiple projects. So when I was practicing, I would typically have one main project that I was working on, and then be pulled in to help on a few other projects, or much like the writing process now, where you have a project that's in, like a book project. This is what I was focused on mostly for the past 2 years. But there are shorter projects that you get drawn into, or things that are in the idea phase. So you might be in conceptual design with one project, and then really working on the construction documents. And like any deadline-driven field, when you get closer to the deadline, it's all hands on deck, and more hours and more time.
Right.
So that you're not typically spreading out your time, but that's when you might get pulled in on another project in a large firm to help finish those things up.
Well, what you've just described is really the behind-the-scenes work. This is the work of the professional on behalf of the project. But I'm wondering, do you envision a way or a scenario where non-professionals are able to engage in this process, either as individuals or as a community? How might that look in your vision?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways for communities to get involved is to know, or individuals who are in communities, is to know that that pre-design phase is so crucial for getting a good project. So when you hear people giving ideas about, oh, we think we're going to renovate this, or we think we're going to have a new building, or, you know, college campuses have campus plans, right? They're strategic plans years out, long term, of these are the building projects that are underway, and they shift, right? So it doesn't always follow that same project, same progress, the sequencing that was laid out initially. Again, design's always iterative, right? It's always changing.
That's right.
But when you hear that the ideas are being generated about a building, that's the most effective time for community members to get involved. And that's where your expertise really comes into play. The knowledge we have as building users, especially in something like campus buildings, right? We're all experts in the places that we work, right? We know what our work processes are. We know how we want people to relate to each other. These are the kinds of things that we can weigh in on in the pre-design phase, before the decisions are really being made about, you know, the final budget or the scope of the project, or like decisions like who is even in this building, who is this building for? At the pre-design phase, if we can begin to get more people involved in that, in the idea generation, I think we end up with better projects. But even then, during each of these design phases, there are times when people are checking in with the community or with the clients, right? Asking the representatives on behalf of the client or the owner, right? Who is speaking on behalf of the community, right? Or who is speaking on behalf of the user's needs, and actually in those meetings where the progress is being reported and refined and checked, that's very important too. And having a wide cross-section of people who are invited to participate in those phases ultimately makes the design better. You don't want to end up at the end of a project and find out, oh, we don't have enough offices, when your office manager could have told you that, you know, way at the beginning, right? That's an easily avoidable and very expensive mistake, right?
Right.
And if you would just ask the people who know that kind of information before you're further down the road, it makes a project that ultimately everybody enjoys better and is worth the money that you're spending on it.
Because you've talked about the fact architecture and design is just expensive.
It's so expensive, and there are so many resources that go into it. It's such an investment of time, of money, of material resources. When we think about the carbon footprint of our buildings, when we think about the energy usage of our buildings, there's so much that goes on. And they stay around for a very long time,
Yes.
right? So you can redo projects, you can renovate them, and there's a great book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand, and he makes the argument that buildings are always growing and shaping. Design never actually ends, right? So this room was just redone a couple of years ago, but the building is much older, right? You know, every year there's a different space in this library, right? We just had the Book Arts and Letterpress Lab last semester that opened, right? It's an ongoing changing process, right? And so there are ways in which we can get involved in that throughout a building's life cycle, not just in the pre-design phase, not just in the, you know, the construction documents, but even as the life of a building continues, to say, this isn't working, this needs to be addressed, this is amazing, we want to keep this at all costs, right? Making those kinds of design decisions and articulating that becomes an important value of the community.
Yeah, because we can't know all of those needs up front in any way. Well, switching gears just a bit, you've framed your book out around 5 moral commitments that Christians and non-Christians alike can take on in the work of architecture and in the effort of bringing transformative justice into design and into the built environment. And so those 5 are creativity, empathy, discernment, beauty, and sustainability. And fundamentally, I think, as you've been saying, we design buildings for people. They're not designed for robots. They're not designed just for objects. I mean, I'm sure there are some that, you know, where they have mainframes and things like that. But mostly we design buildings for people, where life is taking place. And I love the way that you have integrated this idea that buildings can be a place of shalom. And because of shalom, for delight. What a beautiful idea. And you've really spelled out the fact that shalom is not just about absence of conflict or just kind of a generic peace, but there is well-being built into that. And how do we achieve well-being? Well, we achieve that in a variety of ways, physical and spiritual. So I had never thought about shalom in the context of just enjoyment. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of speak into that a little bit more, cast a vision for how this creative design process can actually be a vehicle for delight.
Yeah, part of it is thinking about design as a process and the building or the object that you end up with, right, as a design, right? I think to get a building that promotes well-being and right relationships, you have to have a process that promotes well-being and right relationships. So you have to be thinking about what are the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of making spaces feel welcoming and treating people with respect and caring for our environment. That needs to be part of the design process in order to get a building that looks like that, right? You know, buildings are human-made. They don't grow out of the ground. They're not natural. That's why we refer to this as the built environment, right, as opposed to like the natural environment or the natural world. But there's a sense in which when we are thinking about what we want spaces to be in this holistic sense of how it makes us feel, we want spaces that do more than just function. Function is very important, and we want spaces that are beautiful. Beauty is really important. But those are kind of the basics, the minimum of what makes a good design or a bad design. So, I mean, I go into spaces all the time that I'm like, this is bad design. Because either it doesn't work, it's not
We really
functional.
can be miserable
Right.
people to walk
Yeah,
through buildings.
I mean, it's all the time. It never shuts off.
Does not,
right?
does not.
It's either like an inappropriate aesthetic, right? It's ugly, or it doesn't fit, right?
Not enough space.
Right, not enough space, right? So it's just a bad design. Design is a problem-solving discipline, right? And it's like, did you solve the problem? No. Okay, you didn't do it right.
Failed.
It's like a quiz, right? Oh, you didn't answer the question. Okay, and that's just a grade you get. So it's this sense of that's the minimum, right? That it has an appropriate aesthetic, that it's aesthetically pleasing, and that it is functional. But there's more to design, right? It's how does it like speak to us? What is the meaning of it? Is it saying something about the community? Is it saying something about the time in which we live, the moment in which we live? Our Provost Brickhouse mentioned brutalist architecture, right? There's this movie out right now, it's Oscar nominated, The Brutalist, which is a very long movie, so I don't expect everyone to have seen it. But it's about this design of a building and the life of the architect and people he's around. But brutalist architecture has this reputation for being ugly, right? And there are a lot of ugly brutalist buildings, but not all of them. So it really was about speaking to a certain kind of time, speaking to the moment after world wars, a time when industrialization and mechanization looks a certain kind of way, and saying what kind of architecture responds to the time that we live in. And that's ultimately what design should be. In addition to questions of beauty and function, it's what's the ethos, what's the meaning, what is the way of life that it represents. And that's what takes it from just good design, meeting the minimal standards, to great design, something excellent, something wonderful, something that uplifts the human spirit.
Well, speaking of beauty, how can architecture in its practice and in its product mirror the creative, liberating work of the Trinity for people and in life?
Yeah, I think this comes back to the relationality of it. So one of the key things, so we have a few students in here who've taken 1350, right? We talk about the Trinity and the development of the doctrines. This is the idea that God is one in three, or three in one. There's this profound unity and equality in the Trinity. What we often call God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. That they're all equal in being and in their way of being and doing in the world. And I think when we think about design, there's this sense of cooperation that should be part of it. And this sense of, I really come at this as a theologian and ethicist from a liberation point of view, which is the idea that God's salvation for us isn't just about what happens in the afterlife, but it's about how we live now and how we relate to others. Are we promoting that sense of cooperation so that as many people as possible can feel the freedom and justice and liberation that God has in mind for us, the abundant life that Christ speaks of, right? Being conformed, right, to this image of something greater than petty religious squabbles, right? Something more than just who's in, who's out, who's part of our group, who's not part of our group. Have you satisfied the religious requirements of the time? You know, we see so many Christian communities that are about this. The point of view that I think by focusing on the Trinity, as you phrased it, or liberation, is that part of salvation is this sense of wholeness and completion. And I'm doing this shape with my hands. The Trinity is often depicted as an isosceles triangle, right? Three equal parts. So this sense of, are we equal? Are we promoting this equality with each other? Are we able to connect to this deeper sense where we can experience life in Christ, life in the divine, which is holding all of this together?
And we also sort of touched on God's economy of grace and how that translates into the work of architects and designers in providing for more than what we deserve in the built environment.
Yeah, and that really comes through in the chapter I wrote about beauty. And my colleague Natalie Carnes has helped me think a lot about this. She has a book about beauty. She has many wonderful books, but the one about beauty has really helped me think through this. Tying it to an economy of grace is the idea that God doesn't give us what we deserve. God gives us so much more than that. This idea of the abundant life is what God promised us and what I think Christian life ought to be about, making that not only for ourselves, but for everyone around us, as God did, right? This self-emptying. And part of what I often see when we look at design, especially when we're talking about community design and making decisions about who gets what kind of resources, is that we want to withhold beauty in favor of something like efficiency or the budget, or like we don't think of delight as something that humans need, right? It's like an extra, like the cherry on top. And I think delight is part of how God created us, right? This capacity to experience something wondrous, to be blown beyond ourselves, this sense of awe and grandeur that we often see, but even like delight in something really small and intricate, right? Like a snail, right? This sense of delight is part of God's economy of grace. And therefore,
excess.
Yes, excess, gratuity, another way of saying grace, right? Gratuity, excessiveness, overflow, right? And so our design aesthetic has to have that kind of frame of mind. Like as Christians, we ought to be concerned about the extension of grace. Are we living out grace and love? Are we communicating that? Does that flow out of us? Does that overflow in the way that we think that flows out of God, right? And so in the beauty chapter in particular, there's this sense of beauty being for all of creation, not just for Christians, definitely not just for the rich, not just for the wealthy, not just for those who can afford it, but are we making sure that everyone has access to delight and beauty because it's simply what is desired by God for every human?
Yeah, right. That's great. You also introduce in the book a concept of womanist theory in architecture, and that probably is not normal dialogue for a lot of people. So I wonder if you could just describe for us what would classify a design in that way.
Yeah, so womanist theology and ethics is really coming out of the experiences of Black women. It's an approach that centers the perspectives of Black women, not to the exclusion of others, but it says that if we look at people in their particulars and we focus on what their individual life stories can tell us and what their collective stories, what their shared experiences at groups, as groups can tell us, then we get more insight into the human condition and into who God is. It's also a form of theology that, like other liberationist forms of theology, says that if we look to people who are often on the margins or on the underside or excluded from dominant discourse, we can find out a kind of information that those of us at the center don't have access to, right? So you can think of the scriptural verse about how it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, right, than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, right? This idea that there's knowledge that someone on the margins, right, someone who is not wealthy could have about the kingdom of God that the rich person with all they have doesn't yet have, right? And so womanist theology says, is there something in the experiences of Black women that we can learn that will help us think through design? One of the points I say, and this is early in the book, is that design is a very hierarchical field. Right? It takes a lot to become a licensed architect. It takes a lot to even get to the point of where you go to college and to know the right kind of college to go to be able to get a degree in architecture that will allow you to practice architecture, right? And then it's at least 5 years in an undergraduate program, not because you needed to repeat a year.
Right, no, that's the 6th year.
Right, that's the 6th year, but because it's a professional program, right? And I know many people here have gone through professional programs in college and university training, and you know that it's not easy, right? And everyone here who's gone through college knows that it's not easy, right? So not only do you have to go through college and university to get at least a professional degree, I got a 4-year non-professional degree and then the 2-year master's degree after that. So that was 6 years to get a professional degree. Then you have to do a training process where you're working in the field. So you're working in an office. That means you have to be able to find a job, which depending on what the economy is like can be difficult, you know, just for no fault of your own. Right. I came out in the late 90s when we were having a dot-com boom. It was amazing. Everyone I know who graduated with me and wanted a job got a job, but they were all amazing, of course. So then you have to get a job, you have to stay employed, you have to have a mentor who signs off on the records that you keep. And of course you have to pay bureaucratic fees all the way through to keep these records, right? And then for my friends who had children, you take time off for that. You're figuring out when to take licensing exams, which is a very long, expensive process also, how to prepare for the exams. All of this means that by the time you get to licensure, that is about 5 steps in of hoops you had to jump through and a lot of money you had to pay to get to that point. Then there's still levels beyond that, right, of you know, various accreditations. But when we look at the stats of who goes into architecture programs, we'll see that it gets less diverse the further along in the field we go. So at college, there are plenty of women and not so many people of color, right? But there are plenty of people in these programs that begins to whittle down so that by the time you look at the numbers of registered architects, the number of women is smaller than the number of men. The number of people of color is smaller, and they're not reflective of the broader society. When I got my architecture license, I was one of 0.2% of licensed architects who are African American women. So that's less than 0.5%. The numbers are much better in academia, right? But still not the best. Less than 0.5%. So that means that in a room of 100 architects, you can't count on one of them being a Black woman. The womanist perspective says that if that's the case, then we cannot leave design to professional designers alone. That if professional designers is an elite class of people who have education, training, that are not diverse, we have to look for other ways to get community buy-in and hear those diverse voices. And so this project was my attempt to name what that would look like.
Thank you. Another one of the commitments that you outline in your book has to do with sustainability. And I'm sure everyone in this room has a general sense of, you know, depleting resources and the harmful effects of urbanization and industrialization. But not everyone may know about the real systems that are in place in professional practice that are looking to insert a much more sustainable mindset. And actually, I really loved the way that you kind of overlaid another one of the moral commitments, which is discernment, into this sustainability mindset. So maybe you could just share what are some of those systems, because people might see some of those acronyms plaqued onto buildings here and there.
Yeah, so there are various certification programs like LEED, that's one of the most popular ones in the US, LEED. And it's a rating system, a certification system for buildings that provides a set of criteria across different kinds of things like material selection or practices related to the local site and the ecology of that, that give you standards on, like, it's a point system of how to meet these criteria, right? The different kinds of decisions you might make. You don't have to have a LEED certified project to gain inspiration from the LEED process. There's another system that I really like called the Just Building System that, it's an acronym also, but the idea is justice is part of it, and it includes things like human well-being and things like beauty for all. Are there spaces that are open to the community that people can delight in? So like the Etsy headquarters, I think, was built with the Just Building framework. So these different systems give us benchmarks. That's not the only way to do it, but I think it's helpful to know that those are out there as resources to consult, because even things like the lists of materials that they say not to use, anyone can look at that and then ask their contractor, are we using this material, right? Is there an alternative for this? This one might be harmful, right? Can we think of something else to do for that? And I think, I do have to say though, the first question you have to ask if you want to be sustainable for design is, do we actually need to do a design or a project here?
Here's the discernment process.
Right? That's discernment, right? I love building things, I love designing things, but that is a use of resources. And in a society that is very consumer-based or uses image as a way to further status, I think we need to be conscious about whether or not that use of materials, and particularly the demolition, whether that is worth it. Everything that's demolished has to go somewhere. And most of us are concerned with recycling in our own homes, but if you think about where all the waste of an entire building goes, that's such a big decision. It goes to a landfill, unless you're thinking sustainably about the kinds of materials that you're using and how they might get recycled. Another program I mentioned in that chapter on sustainability is the cradle to cradle approach, which is the idea that everything you're putting into the building will be used again in some other form. So the idea, it's like eternal recycling, right? It cradle to cradle instead of like cradle to grave. It never goes into the landfill. It always gets rediverted and reused in some way.
But the amazing thing about progress in manufacturing and just thinking more intelligently is that that's actually possible.
Yes.
To reuse these products are not just going into the
And
landfill.
I see it all the time. Like, I'll be in the airport and I'm looking at the flooring and I'm like, yeah, that's recyclable,
That's recycled.
right? That
Bottle caps.
Right, that's recycled and it can be recycled again, right? And I'm like, yes, they're making these decisions, often from a budget standpoint, but sometimes to reach these status. I think.
Yeah, I think that we probably have run out of time. So, and we want to leave time for y'all to ask some questions. So, y'all just shout them out as you get the magical box of microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. That was great. I want to offer you a biblical mangled proof text. Leviticus 19 says, "Do not insult or curse the deaf, or be a stumbling block to the blind." So I'm wondering if, I want to talk about acoustics. Is there such a thing as theological acoustics? It's my impression that institutions, not anyone in particular, but institutions strive to only meet the minimum requirements of ADA. When it comes to hearing impairment, the burden is on the individual.
Yeah.
So the individual is told to sit next to a speaker, which, by the way, I get. But they're also told that there are assisted hearing devices, and people who are in need of those already wear them, and so that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I am wondering, and I do have an experience of one building on campus where I think acoustics could have been improved and was ignored. So what is the role of, is acoustics cost prohibitive, or in
No.
theological ethics, how do you respond to hearing impairment, or
No.
even issues of people not being able to see?
Yeah, I think acoustics is not that expensive, but it requires a kind of attention and design thinking to address it. So a lot of acoustics has to do with the absorption of the materials in the room, and the reverberation, right? So how sound is reverberating when we've all been in spaces that are very echoey, right? And it's hard to make out conversation, and so then people get louder, and it just makes the problem worse, right? But that happens on a smaller scale. Even when we can't hear the echo, there are other things happening. So the study of acoustics is a specialized area of design. In order to have people thinking about what kinds of acoustic needs we need in a building, we have to acknowledge that there are different kinds of physical needs, including people who have different hearing sensitivities, and to make that part of the design process routinely. You mentioned ADA being a minimum standard, right? And it is. It's been adopted into a lot of building codes, but at its heart, it's a civil rights law, which is the idea that people deserve to have access to the same kinds of spaces, because that's what it means to be inclusive and to provide equality. And so if our spaces are not designed for people with visual impairments, hearing impairments, to be able to access, and churches do this as well, right? So it's not just, churches sometimes meet the minimal standards, but then you look at places like the pulpit, and they don't even meet the standards for mobility, right? You can't even like get up to pray if you can't walk up there without assistance, right? So I think we just need a more expansive vision of what it looks like to be inclusive, and we need to have processes that invite the people who can name that for us. All of us are partial in the sense that we only know what we know. We know our experience, and we know what those who have said something to us have shared, right? So that's why we need to seek out other people's stories and experiences so that we can get a fuller picture of what our building should be, right? So I think that goes back to pre-design, and in those interim checks during the construction process, saying, do we have concerns here? Now that we know what the shape of this room is, how might we address the acoustics in this? Or thinking at the very beginning, is acoustics going to be a priority? But yes, I think the theological principle of justice there, which is what my book is about, it carries through.
We have a question from Jenny Matheny. Sorry if I destroyed your name. The womanist lens and architecture is a powerful perspective that I would have never thought to bring together. Thinking through the womanist lens and design, can you share a specific insight you have gained from your work or the work of others with beauty, architecture, and/or ethics?
Yeah, so I can think about, there's an example I give in the book about design restrictions. So I did some study in New Orleans after Katrina. I was a graduate student, so this is when I was still working on my Ph.D. I got some funding to be able to look at a housing development in New Orleans that was being redeveloped at the time. And it's a beautiful design, and this community is building housing for lower and middle income families, and the design has front porches, which is very much in keeping with the character of New Orleans. But in my studies, I came across work by Laura McTighe, who was working with a group there, and noted and was talking about how in certain places after Katrina, they were putting in restrictions on front porches and how many people can gather on a front porch. Now, this was specifically targeting Black communities, right? And it had to do with like some presumed concern over safety, which is what loitering laws are often about, right? They're supposedly about, you know, the safety of number, but it all comes down to like, who do you think it's okay to gather, right? And who is looking at certain people and saying, oh, there's too many of them, that must be unsafe. I feel unsafe when too many of those kind of people are gathering. So a womanist perspective is going to say we actually have to look at the practices of how people live. And in many African diasporic communities, the living space is not just the interior space, but bleeds out into the front porch and the front lawn. Even today, when I talk to people from different parts of the South, different Black people from different parts of the South, they'll talk about practices like sweeping the yard and maintaining the front porch, because that was where you were welcoming people in to the home at right when you cross over into the lawn, like not the front door, right? So if we're looking at womanist theology and ethics and saying the experiences of Black women and their communities count, then we're going to say it's not, we should never be passing restrictions about safety that are looking at a community who's not even the primary driver of, like, who is the safety for and how does it relate to the people who are actually living there. Some of those laws were repealed, but they're all over the place, right? You'll still find those.
Oh, okay. Hi. Along those lines, I was wondering, because you were speaking earlier about the design process and making sure that it's inclusive, what are your thoughts on redesigning or repurposing spaces that were intentionally exclusive to certain populations at some point?
Yeah.
Are there ways to ethically do that? And if so, what are some of those steps?
Yeah, in the process, so the chapter on empathy is where I talk about, is it the chapter on creativity or empathy? So creativity, I talk about as setting a vision, right? And so that's where you would set this ethical vision of, like, we want the building to be inclusive. We want it to address the needs of people who have, who need hearing aids, right? Or people who have visual impairments, right? We want the building to address the legacies of exclusion that were part of it, right? That's in the vision setting. The empathy chapter, I talk about what it means to actually show love for our neighbors, right? So this is a Christian value, right? Loving our neighbors, right? The idea that good design requires that we actually get to know our neighbors and hear their stories. So one way of doing that is a process known as charrette, which I see people nodding their heads. In design communities, you often have this at the beginning of a process anyway. Sometimes it's just internal to the design firm or the practice, where you're just doing idea generation, right? If we can actually get that process with the communities, involving the people who we said were excluded, first of all, I think we need to start, the discernment chapter talks about this. Discernment is making wise decisions. With the question always, who should be included in this decision that we are not including, right? So once you begin to say, okay, who are we excluding? Oh, the people who had a history here, right? So I think of like mural projects we've done in East Waco through Creative Waco, where we've done a whole community discernment process, right? You have to then invite community members in, make it at a time and place where they're likely to come, provide the resources to actually engage that, right? So food, snacks, right? The visual resources to say, what do you like? So you're not just saying, oh, tell us what you like, but you're actually showing visual representations, right? Because people are very bad at describing what you like. Right. You need to be able to see it, to envision it. But I think there's something about a charrette process that invites in other people, where you begin this, this design thinking with a wide group, and then continuing to include people of that underrepresented community or excluded community. At the very least, I think we can do a better job with signage of naming the communities that were in places before and acknowledging their erasure by, at the very least, putting up signs that say this community was here before, much in the way that we did a land acknowledgement here, right? We're the people who occupy the land now, but we're not the only ones who are here.
If I may, I have one last question, and I'm afraid it's totally predictable. But when you think about Baylor's buildings, where do you see design elements that you find particularly intriguing?
I can think of two, right? One, I just love Elliston Chapel. I love the scale of it. I love the imagery in that chapel. There are other chapels that I do not like the imagery in them. Representational art that depicts mostly white people is offensive to me. So I like more non-representational art or things that talk about the spirit. And there's a way in Elliston Chapel that I see those elements coming together. But I also really appreciate the library building, the libraries, these two facilities here that have been joined, because they're constantly changing and you always see the activity here. So one of the core arguments I have in the book is that buildings don't have a kind of agency on their own. They don't do anything, right? It's the people who design them and who live in them and who interpret them that are doing the work, right? That are making sense of them. And in the libraries, there's constantly people doing, right? There are people who are using the space, which is making it active and feel like a community space. It wouldn't feel like that if the people were so dispersed or if it was designed in a way that people couldn't gather. So I love the flexibility of this.
Or if it served primarily books.
Right, and that's a way that libraries have changed over the past couple decades. There are still books here, which I appreciate when I'm in my writing group and I need a book and I'm like, yes, it's right there. I'll go grab it from the shelf, right? And I love the resources of the library in the digital archives, and there's so much that we have here. But so the way the library has changed, even over the decade I've been at Baylor, is just an exemplification of what I think this process should be.
And did you know that Jones is shaped like a book open from plan view?
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
But I love books.
Free little tip for you.
Thank you so much for being here today. I've really enjoyed getting to know your work a little bit better, both to Dr. Edwards and Dr. Theriot. Appreciate you being here. Please join me in thanking the two of them. We do have books for purchase and books for signing back in the back, so we invite you to go participate in that. And I also want to invite you to the next Reader Meet the Author, which will be Dr. Dave Bridge, who is an associate professor of political science. And his book is entitled Pushback: The Political Fallout of Unpopular Supreme Court Decisions. He will be interviewed by Jeremy Counselor, our Dean of the Law School. So I welcome you to that on March 25th. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks again to Ann and Elise.